Welcome to WCG Talks Trials, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of clinical research, sharing the latest trends, insights, and best practices from experts across the industry. In each episode of WCG Talks Trials, we'll explore a different area of the clinical trial industry, while featuring a diverse range of clinical research and medical professionals. If you're passionate about advancing clinical research, improving patient outcomes, and driving healthcare forward, then WCG Talks Trials is the right podcast for you. We are so glad you could join us today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Popey, Vice President of Clinical Science with WCG Research Solutions, and I am absolutely thrilled to be your host for today's episode, where we will be discussing some of the measurement challenges in PTSD clinical trials and an exciting technical solution our team has developed. But before we dive in, let me remind you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on your favorite listening platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so you never miss an episode of WCG Talks Trials. Today, we are joined by two of our best and brightest from WCG Research Solutions, Senior Clinical Scientist Dr. Neely Cheney and ECOA Senior Clinical Scientist Alyssa Conrad. Neely, Alyssa, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and how and why you got involved in the clinical research industry? Neely, let's start with you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for having me on the podcast today. I'm super excited to be here. My professional background is in clinical psychology with a PhD in the field. For many years, I conducted neuropsychological testing in a private practice setting, primarily working with children and adolescents. I did assessments for ADHD, learning disabilities, IQ testing, which ultimately sparked my passion for clinical ratings. Approximately 15 years ago, I transitioned into clinical trials at the site level, marking the beginning of my career and journey as a clinical rater here in the beautiful San Diego, where I currently reside. And from there, it was really history. After gaining valuable experience at the site level, I moved into the realm of the rater training world. And that's where I've been able to really leverage firsthand experience with rating scales to help develop and to standardize training programs. Having this unique perspective of working on both sides of the rater world has really allowed me to understand the practical applications of the various scales and to really contribute to the improvement of training programs and rating instruments. I'm very proud to say that I've been now a part of the WCG family for 11 years, where I continue to dedicate my experience to this field.
Awesome, Neely. Thank you. And we've been blessed to have you as part of that family for those years. Alyssa, same question to you. Tell us a little bit about your background, how you got involved in the clinical research industry.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Well, I'm a clinician by training, and I worked as a mental health therapist about 18 years ago now, in both in and outpatient settings. My interest in assessing patients is what really led me to start working at a clinical trial site where I was a rater and sub-investigator administering various assessments for patients with psychiatric and cognitive disorders. Back then, almost everything was administered on paper, so I saw firsthand how easy it was to make mistakes administering these scales, even if it was just a simple calculation error or inadvertently skipping a question. After working as a site rater, I joined a CRO focusing on rater training and surveillance. And here I observed how even the most experienced raters can make very simple errors that can have a big impact on the data, which could be very problematic in clinical trials. So this realization led to my interest in finding ways to improve the accuracy and consistency of administering assessments, which is what naturally brought me to ECOA. So here I can combine my experience as a rater and reviewer with electronic functionality to help standardize the administration and scoring of scales. My goal has always been to make assessments as intuitive and user-friendly as possible for raters, reduce error, and ultimately improve data quality for clinical trials. And I'm happy to say I've been here for about 4.5 years now.
That's great. Thanks, Alyssa. Thank you both. I absolutely love hearing your stories. You both bring such strong and relevant backgrounds, along with a real passion for clinical trials and endpoint evaluation. And that's no doubt informed your work at WCG. And we've been blessed to have you over these years. So, with that background, how about we dive into our topic for today's episode? Neely, to get us started, for those of us who may be less familiar with the CAPS 5 scale, can you give us an overview of the scale and the way it's used in various settings in clinical trials?
Absolutely. I'd love to provide a brief overview of the CAPS 5. So, the CAPS 5, or the Clinician Administered PTSD scale for the DSM 5, is a 30-item structured interview, and it's used for post traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. It was originally developed at the National Center for PTSD in about 1989. And it's really considered what we call the gold standard measure for PTSD. The scale assesses all the DSM 5 criteria for PTSD. It assesses symptom severity, and it's often used in clinical trials as the primary endpoint measure in PTSD studies. So there are different versions of this scale, and I'll give a little bit more detail about that. There's the past month and the past week version of the scale. The past month version is typically used at the screening visit, and at the screening visit, we use the scale to establish eligibility. We also have the past week version, and that's used at baseline, or it would also be used at all the other visits to establish symptom severity. Me and Alyssa were actually pretty lucky to meet the scale author, Dr. Frank Weathers, and work with him in creating the electronic form build of the CAPS 5 for a study we worked together for WCG.
Excellent. Very informative. So, with that context, Neely, can you describe for our audience some of the challenges that research professionals, investigators, raters, and the like encounter with the traditional implementation of the CAPS 5?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. So, one of the most important and challenging things for the CAPS 5 scale, and really also other scales that we use in clinical trials, is standardization, which means following the scoring and administration guidelines closely. Even though the CAPS 5 is a semi structured scale in which the raters are required to follow a structured guide or a sort of script, there's a lot of room for error. It's very, very important for CAPS 5 raters to closely follow the guidelines for scoring and administration. This is something we really train and remediate our raters about, making sure that they don't deviate from the script and closely follow the prompts and follow up questions. Following the guidelines within the CAPS 5, it increases the reliability and validity. And really, not following these scoring and administration guidelines, it decreases the reliability and validity, which in turn makes it hard to detect treatment effects. Although the CAPS 5 is only 30 items, each item has additional follow up items. There's also many skip out rules, there's algorithms, there's a scoring grid that needs to be followed. And so there's a lot of things that really within the scale, raters need to closely follow. The scale itself is pretty complex, and it does take a skilled rater who understands PTSD to really maneuver through the questions. There's a lot of opportunities for raters to make administration and scoring errors. And this in turn can lead to patient burden by maybe asking too many questions that aren't necessary and it could also lead to calculation errors. I myself have a lot of experience in testing. I have a lot of experience with ratings. I'm a skilled diagnostician. I initially found this scale to be initially challenging to administer, and it really did take myself some time to practice it and really learn the new dance, I say, and get my feet
Mm-hmm.
acclimated with administering the scale comfortably. So, Alyssa can actually discuss in more detail how the electronic form build has really helped with some of the limitations of the paper form.
Yeah, great, Neely. Thank you for that. And we're going to go there next. But I just want to say, I think you made two really critical points here. Number one, the CAPS-5 is a really critical scale in the clinical trial space for PTSD, but elsewhere as well. Very critical. It is the gold standard. It is frequently employed. But as you so well describe, and I really appreciate some of your insights there, Neely, it is challenging to administer. It does take a fair amount of skill. And even when you are skilled, there are some complexities around administration that can impact the validity and reliability of assessments. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Alyssa, a few years ago, and I honestly, I have very fond memories of this, you led the development of an electronic or eCOA version of the CAPS-5 scale. Tell us about some of the improvements that were implemented with the eCOA CAPS-5.
Thanks, Chris. This is definitely one of my favorite projects to work on since
Mm-hmm.
I've been with WCG. We were very fortunate to be able to implement several improvements to the scale. First, we were able to incorporate clinical guidance from the scale authors training directly into the electronic form. This ensures that raters are reminded of the correct administration and scoring of the items while they are conducting the assessment. Dynamically displayed messages are programmed to notify raters of inconsistencies in scoring, allowing them to correct errors in real time. And this reduces the likelihood of errors and facilitates continuous improvement in the rater's performance over time. This also assists raters in conducting the assessment without needing to review a manual or guidance materials during the administration. A second improvement is in the administration of the form. Participants are asked to answer several questions about a particular traumatic event in their lives. In order for responses to remain comparable throughout the trial, the event that they are referencing needs to stay the same. When the form is administered on paper, participants who have experienced multiple traumatic events may forget which event they were referencing during a previous administration. And as the CAPS-5 is typically administered several times throughout a PTSD trial, there are many opportunities for the traumatic event to be incorrectly remembered. So the solution for this, our electronic form has the event that the participant referenced during the first administration populated at the beginning of all the subsequent administrations and instructs the raters to remind them of which event this is and to tell the subjects when they are at the beginning of the start point of each assessment. Another critical improvement made in our electronic form is as the author of the scale emphasizes the importance of fluidity and efficiency in conducting the interview, we've added skip logic that prompts raters to ask only the necessary follow-up questions based on previous responses. This ensures essential data is captured while skipping irrelevant questions, which prevents over-administration and overburdening the participant. This also allows raters to focus on the participant, helping to establish good rapport and making them feel comfortable while discussing topics that are potentially very sensitive.
I will say the same thing I said to you, Alyssa, several years ago when you demoed this form. Wow. As a former investigator and site rater who has directly experienced some of the challenges that you and Neely have described thus far today, I have to say that these improvements are quite exciting and impactful. Tell me, though, how can the use of our version of the form help standardize scale administration and scoring in clinical research?
Sure. So our migration of the CAPS-5 simplifies the complexities in scoring by automating the process. The scoring algorithms that are typically done manually by raters are implemented electronically in our version, minimizing variability in raters' interpretation of scoring. And as Neely mentioned earlier, manual scoring can introduce errors that create noise in the data. By implementing automated scoring, we eliminate the need for manual calculations, which significantly reduces human error and ensures consistent, accurate results. This is essential for ensuring that data collected across different sites and raters remain reliable and comparable.
Excellent. Neely, you and Alyssa have presented research posters at two major conferences in recent months. Specifically, in this case, comparing paper and ECOA administrations of the CAPS-5 across a large number of assessments. Tell us about those results.
Yes, we were able to represent WCG at two major conferences, and the results we presented were astronomical. What we found was that the paper administration of the CAPS-5 showed over twice the rate of quality issues versus the ECOA build, and this difference was statistically significant. This is a very big deal because in clinical trials, rater error in the CAPS-5 assessments is a source of variability. And being able to reduce this error through our electronic build with real-time clinical guidance, automated scoring, and other features can help standardize scale administration and scoring, which in turn reduces error variance and improves signal detection in trials. So again, these results were really promising and really a big deal for us just as a company and whole. And what I do also have to say is when I would speak to site raters just during the training process, they had a huge sigh of relief when I would speak to them and say that there was an electronic form build that had automated calculations, skip out rules and things of that such for the CAPS-5. So it was really such a big deal for us to have this build.
Absolutely. I think that that's really good rater feedback. And I think that what we observed with your research was that raters who were similarly experienced and similarly trained simply had fewer errors and higher quality with the ECOA version. It was really the scale that made the impact. And so I think that that's really exciting. Those are
100%.
Exactly. Those are very important findings indeed. And I think findings that really speak to an even broader topic. Alyssa, how are these findings promising for the future of deploying electronic scales over traditional paper-based methods?
That's a great question, Chris. As we've seen such positive results with the research on the CAPS-5, we've continued to use the same methodologies in developing all of our assessments. I'm happy to share that we now have over 800 electronic assessments in our library. We continue to work closely with scale authors and key opinion leaders for many of our forms and add guidance into all forms where it is most helpful for raters. We also leverage the data from studies where we include our independent review service and can access the most frequently occurring errors on forms to identify where extra guidance and form logic is needed. As we did in the CAPS-5, we use dynamically displayed messages to notify raters of inconsistencies in scoring in real time, allowing raters to adjust scores promptly as needed. We are always thinking of innovative ways of using logic throughout the forms for calculations and complex scoring that were traditionally done on paper, which were subject to so many errors. But most importantly, we are fortunate to have a very knowledgeable ECOA team that includes psychiatrists, neuropsychologists, and other clinicians who have extensive experience as PIs, raters, and in rater training and surveillance. This allows us to use our expertise as clinicians to determine where errors typically would occur and how to reduce them. While building each and every scale, we reflect back on our time as raters and create the form through the lens of what would have helped me administer and score this assessment better. This is what is unique about our approach. Our clinicians are the actual ones creating the electronic forms. This is different from traditional ECOA development models where programmers are building the forms and likely don't have the clinical expertise to identify where errors are likely to occur in order to maximize the capabilities technology has to offer to assist raters. The benefits we've seen during our research, showing the significant improvement of data quality, using the methodologies we described today, generated by our expert clinicians, clearly indicate that WCG's built by clinicians for clinicians approach is the optimal solution for the future of clinical trials research.
Excellent. I will just say this, Alyssa, as a clinician, I have to say I love that approach. Neely, Alyssa, this was an excellent and very informative discussion. I think our audience has learned a lot about some of the measurement challenges in PTSD trials, and more importantly, about one of the tools our expert team has developed to address them. Before we wrap up, I just want to thank you both, Alyssa, Neely, for joining us today and sharing your insights on this episode of WCG Talks Trials. And thank you, as always, to our listeners for tuning in. If you have any questions or would like more information about this topic or other WCG services, please feel free to visit wcgclinical.com. We hope that you found this episode insightful and that you will join us for future episodes of WCG Talks Trials. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of WCG Talks Trials. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred listening platform as we continue to explore different areas of the clinical research industry. As always, we encourage you to join in the conversation. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics you'd like to hear on the show by visiting us at wcgclinical.com/podcast. We're here to serve as a trusted resource as we work to improve lives and accelerate clinical research together.